I'm just going to say a couple words, and everybody knows already, so I won't do the intro. I'll ask Dr. Dominguez and Dr. Moran do it themselves. It will probably be very self-explanatory. So welcome to our first Illuminate integration lecture, the first lecture. And so if one quick reminder, if you're not using your real name, so to speak, you're using a nickname or your family account, could you please change your name to, first name and last name so that the LLC office can keep track of it? Okay, our attendance. So that's all I want to say. I'm gonna ask Dr. Moran and Dr. Dominguez to start. So thank you so much.
Sure, I'll just say hi first. I'm Dr. Moran from Communication, and it's super nice to be with you guys tonight. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the Zoom stage with Dr. Dominguez. And the way we have it set up is that she's gonna go ahead and start, and then we'll transition to me, and then we'll kind of go back and finalize our thoughts together and then open it up for questions. So again, I teach in communication. I study primarily entertainment media, and I look at kind of the relationships that audiences have with media use and how that impacts their identity and how they see the world. So kind of fun.
Great, and I'm Dr. Dominguez, and I teach political science, focusing on American politics, especially elections and campaigns and political parties and the presidency. That brings us to our topic for today, which is how should we be thinking about the relationship between the media and presidential campaigns, and questions about truth and lies and fact and fiction, and whose job is it to tell the truth to the American people, and if we tell them the truth, will they even believe it? So those are some of the questions that we're going to talk about today, and I'm in charge of the PowerPoint, so I'm going to go ahead and boot that up. Please let us know, wave a hand or something, if anything happens to the audio, or if you have any, I think maybe we'll try to save questions for the end, but if you want to put questions in the chat as we go, we can come down there and see if there are any questions that we want to address when we get to the end. So just as a reminder what we're doing here, this is the integration series, and as a first-year student, you have to take 2 classes that ask you to think, they're regular classes, but then as part of these classes, we're asking you to think about how to make connections between one class in one field or one discipline and a class in another discipline. And part of that is introducing you to the fact that different disciplines are going to ask different questions sometimes, use different methods to understand the truth, but then also, okay. I'm going to try that again. Was my screen share working? Mm-hmm. It was, okay. It said it was not working. All right. Different disciplines have different methods of finding the truth. Different disciplines have different questions they ask, and different disciplines can approach the same question, but from different points of view. And so that's kind of the thing, that's kind of the fun way that we're going to approach this topic today. We're going to try to address the questions that we're all having about truth and facts in the campaign season with the wisdom of 2 different academic disciplines, political science and communication studies. So I'm the political scientist, and I'm going to say political scientists actually know a lot, right? We know a lot about how voters process information during presidential elections. And just to give us a sort of a fun introduction to this topic and what political scientists know, I'm going to ask you to play a Kahoot with us. And I bet this isn't going to work until I share my screen again. I'm getting good at this now. So where's my Kahoot? It wants me, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to get thanks maybe later. That's what we're doing. All right, and we're going to play this one, and we're going to play. Right. Classic Kahoot. Does everybody know how to play a Kahoot? Oh, good. You guys have done this before. So yeah, you're going to go to www.kahoot.it and you're going to put in this game pin. And then we're all going to be able to play a little quiz game together, a little game show. All right, that's probably close to everybody. All right, let's go ahead and play. The question is, what do you know? All right, so about half of you got that a district attorney is the person who is the prosecutor in a state or city. Good job, Sophia. Here's the second part of that question. How many Americans do you answer it correctly? Oh, some of you guessed, some of you lowballed it, but about half of Americans know what a district attorney is. Good job, Paige. Here's a simple American politics question for you. All right, so here, about half of you got this one right. About 2/3 of the American public knows, oh, darn it, that's not right. It's a 2/3 vote to override a veto. The next question is, how many Americans know the answer? All right, again, about half of you got that right. And some of you are guessing the lower answer, and you're on track with something, because the idea is that people don't know the answers to these things. But think about that. You know, barely more than a majority, less than 2/3 of Americans know this pretty basic piece of information. Good job, Natalie. Okay, and there we go. Less than half of you know that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. But how many Americans know the answer to that? So the correct answer is only 9% of Americans know the name of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. A couple more here. Good job, 37 of you. This is not a terribly hard question, right? That was tricky how I used two. How many senators are there from your state? Oh, I instead of the number, I guess. Good job, Molly. All right, about half of Americans know that every state has 2 senators. These are not terribly hard questions. Good job, Jason. Four and 8 is the correct answer. Most people didn't get that one right. All right. And the last question, what percentage of Americans do you think know that? Oh, good. More of you got that one. But only a third know the answer to that question. Let's see. I'm going to go back into the PowerPoint. Let me know if I didn't do that right and you can't see it. But, you know, what's the basic message? Here, I'll stop. I'll ask. What's the basic message that you're getting out of this simple little quiz?
That there's still a large majority of people who don't know the truth to simple questions.
Yeah, the vast majority of Americans these are not tough ones, right? Nobody's asking for the details about the tax code or anything. This is like, how many senators do you have? Most people don't know this stuff. And so if you're gonna think about public opinion in the United States, you have to start from there, from the idea that actually most people don't know anything. And there's lots and lots and lots of other surveys that will show that important fact about America. Of course, people with college educations and people who are older are going to do a little bit better. People who are younger and have only a high school education are going to do a little bit less well, even on simple questions like who's the Speaker of the House, or what's the unemployment rate? Like, ballpark, what's the unemployment rate? This is going to be something that people with college degrees are going to do better on. People with a high school education are going to do less well on. But the fact of the matter is most Americans don't have a college education, and this is the pool of voters that we're talking about when we're thinking about presidential elections. So people don't know very much, and people don't follow political news very closely. Now, that if you are in a community that follows political news closely, that sounds bananas, because some of us live and breathe political news and information, and it's hard to escape. But the fact of the matter is that we are, if you are one of those people like me, you are a weirdo. Most people do not follow political news very closely at all. Here's something else that political scientists know. Just really quickly, I'm not going to ask you, we're not going to do a poll or anything, but in your heart, answer this question. What do you think of Donald Trump? Do you trust him? Would you vote for him? You know the answer. Most people know the answer to that question. Although people will call themselves an independent sometimes, in fact, most people are behavioral partisans. Over the last 75 years, we've been surveying Americans and asking them, hey, how do you feel about the parties? And the answer has been very consistent. Most people vote with the political party. They either vote with the Democrats or they vote with the Republicans, no matter what they tell you. They might tell you, well, I'm an independent, or I'm not sure, I don't really like the two parties. If they vote, they're a partisan. Most. And the reason for that is that party ID is essential. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Political parties help us understand the political world. And very often we're socialized into a political party. Some communities are more socialized into political parties than others. And it's a very reliable way to explain and predict how someone's going to vote. Minorities, single women, tend to be more democratic consistently. White people, evangelical Protestants, evangelical Protestants, men, married men especially, tend to be more Republican. And that's reflected not just in what they say their partisanship is, but also how they vote. They identify with their party, and they also then trust the sources of information about politics that are associated with their political party. So people who are in the president's party usually like the president, whether that's Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton. People who are in the other party usually don't like him that much. This is kind of extreme right now, but it's always been like that, with varying degrees of variation over time. One of the things that is also true is that people who are partisan have partisan attitudes about information and process information through their partisanship. So you can see some examples of that here. As the president's message started to change over time in the spring about the pandemic, see the part there where Democrats and Republicans had very similar responses about how they thought of the pandemic when the president and the Democrats were all giving similar messaging about it. And when the president's messaging started to be more dismissive, then Republicans started to think the virus was less of a big deal. This is filtered through not just partisanship, but also how much people pay attention to political information. Those who not only are partisan, but also pay a lot of attention to the political news are more likely to interpret events and issues and elections, obviously, through that partisan screen. And you can see that here with people who are on the left-hand graph. We have people who pay less attention to politics, and the Democrats and Republicans have slightly different reactions to the pandemic and supporting canceling meetings and that kind of thing. But people who pay more attention to politics on the right-hand side are quite a bit more partisan in their attitudes and responses. So when we think about truth and we think about facts and fact-checking and the media and the way that people are going to respond to truth and lies, we have to understand that all of that is taking place in an environment where most people don't know anything, and most people process information in a partisan way, either more or less partisan, depending on how embedded in their political information they are. But most people are going to process political information through their partisanship. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Moran for a little while.
Great, thanks, Dr. Dominguez. I'm gonna let you still go forward on the slides, so thank you. What I'm gonna talk about tonight particularly is the role of journalism. So communication studies is a pretty broad discipline. We study communication in all its forms. Part of that is what's going on in the media, and other people study what's happening in interpersonal face-to-face relationships, but tonight we're going to focus primarily on what is going on with journalism in the context of a political campaign. So we kind of ask, what is the role of journalism in the election? Oh, we have transitions. And so we are excited. So the first thing is that it's going to provide information about your political candidates. And the journalists are not necessarily coming up with this information. There's a lot of people who work in campaigns who are providing information directly to the journalists, who then either take that at face value and explain candidates, or they're going to do their own investigative reporting to dive into where a candidate stands on particular political issues. We also know that journalists in the United States have a watchdog role to play. So we have our branches of government, and we either can refer to journalists as the watchdog. We sometimes call them the fourth estate, which means that that is the organization or institution that we as Americans rely on to provide checks and balances to the people we vote into political office. So we are hoping that journalists provide that accountability so that we as citizens know that our politicians that we have elected into office are doing what we want them to do, and that they are, behaving ethically and doing the things that we hope the government is going to do to protect us. But how does this look in practice? You can show all the bullet points, Dr. Dominguez. There we go. So we know that people look for information in a political environment for things that reinforce their current beliefs. We see the partisan attitudes about a lot of different issues, and this plays into the selections of media sources that you as an individual citizen are going to do. So people are going to look to sources about their candidate that reinforce the attitude that they already have. We also know that fact-checking doesn't really work to undo your partisan beliefs. And when journalists report on something that is against your pre-existing attitude, for example, say you believe that masks are not necessary to control the virus, and you read an article that says actually masks are an important part of mitigating coronavirus, because of your pre-existing attitude, you are more likely to identify that challenge to your belief as bias rather than an actual evidential fact that might be challenging your belief system. So the political affiliation that we see showing up in a lot of voting practices and attitudes about general behavior is also dictating how audiences move through media and move through what journalists tell us. We also know that during a political campaign, name recognition and promotion of political candidates is a really important element for journalists. And because, as Dr. Dominguez points out, political knowledge isn't necessarily the way people make decisions about who they want to vote for. Sometimes they just get a feeling about a candidate based on their political affiliation or just a name that they recognize. Where political communication is all about is persuading undecided voters. But if you remember that chart from a couple of slides ago, the undecided group, the truly undecided voter, is a teeny tiny percentage of the total voting population. So on the one hand, you could say, well, that then doesn't matter, right? If campaigns are used to persuade undecided voters, could that really make that big of a difference? Well, in fact, that teeny tiny group of undecided voters are often the ones who push an election one way or the other, because the predictable behavior of political affiliation, as we see, is not that different, or it's about 50-50, not 50-50, but 40-40, and then you've got a little group in the middle that's changing everything. So, you can go forward. Yep, so we know that the role of journalists is a watchdog role. That's like a fundamental American kind of belief. We believe in free speech. We believe that journalists should be providing information. But interestingly enough, this role of the journalist is also partisan. And that while overall 70% of Americans believe that journalists should participate in this watchdog role, only 42% of Republicans hold that belief, while 89% of Democrats do. So even the role of journalists and journalism in the United States is challenged based on your political affiliation. And if you look at kind of the difference, it highlights some of the political rhetoric that's coming out from the Republican Party about journalists, and you see a lot of lower levels of trust if you have that political affiliation with mainstream media. We also see other characteristics about the role of journalism divided by political party. So, you know, in a democracy, we expect that journalists might critique certain policies or ideas that are coming out of political offices or governors or the president, but yet that criticism, again, Democrats find that to be a good thing, whereas Republicans see that as problematic. If you're looking at news bias, self-reporting, Democratic affiliation, only 53% of Democrats will say that news organizations tend to favor one side, whereas 87% of Republicans are saying that. So the media, even the role is different, and the attitude about bias is different based on party. Trustworthiness in general has been declining over time. We kind of go up and down with trust in media sources, but we're kind of at a little bit of a low right now. But again, the trust is even lower among Republicans. And whether or not the national news media do very well at keeping us informed, only 18% of Republicans believe that we can be well informed from our journalists, whereas 33% of Democrats, which is a still pretty low number. So trust and belief in our news media is pretty low in both parties, I would say. So as a media scholar, what might we do with this information? You know, we know that selective attention matters. We know that people are learning information from the news, but they're not trusting it very well. So why is this happening? So as a media scholar, we're going to ask, like, what are the rituals in reporting that lead to the frequency of certain stories? So why do we see the things that we see, and how does that impact behavior and attitudes? And look, I have a typo in the second one. What sources do, it should say, journalists rely on, and how does that impact content? We have a lot of research that indicates that journalists rely on official sources rather than kind of people on the street. So I don't know if you remember, after the 2016 election, a lot of journalists were criticized because they predicted that Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide, and she didn't. But a lot of scholars asked, well, how did they not know, right? How did they like miss that investigative reporting role of their job? And some people attribute that to the fact that they were just talking to pollsters and talking to campaign managers and not really talking to a wide variety of people to figure out what was going on. The other thing that we're interested in in communication is, how does the content we see impact our attitudes and behaviors? We know that the more the news media cover a particular issue, the more likely people will say that issue is important. So if we have coverage about wildfires and climate change, right now we have seen voters now, because of this last couple of weeks, saying that climate change is a big issue in this political campaign, whereas 4 weeks ago, that wasn't really being talked about. And so as news media coverage changes, perceptions about the importance of certain political ideas vary. We also wonder too about the agenda. We talk a lot about, do politicians set the agenda by releasing information to journalists who then cover it? Or are journalists the ones who set the agenda because they're doing investigations that then demand political responses? It varies over time. The other thing that gets a lot of popularity that people are asking about in the popular press is about media bias. So there's a lot of information out there about a lack of trust in the media because everybody's biased anyway. So the next little slide will show that indeed our news media can be divided into different perspectives. And this doesn't mean that they're lying to you. It means that they're telling you information that's framed in a particular way. And so if you are paying attention to media sources that are on the extreme kind of red right, you are more likely to see information that will reinforce kind of an extreme conservative attitude. And if you're looking at things on the way blue L, you're more likely to see perspectives that will reinforce a more progressive or liberal attitude. But what's interesting to note is that most of the mainstream media that we think of as like the places like the New York Times and NBC and BBC and all of these other things, that they're not that extreme and they are not that biased. And for the most part, you can rely and trust in the news media to provide truthful information for the most part. And of course, the more extreme you get in the cable networks, most people know what they're getting at that point. And it's not a surprise that those outlets are leaning a particular way. We do know that there's been a lot of questions about social media and the role it plays in misinformation and perpetuating lies. So social media itself is a platform through which information is shared. Social media does not really create its own content. And especially places like Facebook and these other organizations, they do not hire or employ journalists. They rely on other organizations to put that information on their platform. Now, because Facebook is this platform that doesn't take responsibility for the content, there is evidence that there are what's called deep fakes, these what appear to look like news videos that are totally like made up, where they're using artificial intelligence and editing capability to just make stuff up. And there are videos on there that are just made up. You also have fake news, again, information that's provided by non-credible sources that promote misinformation and also hype that information by creating like more accounts to like it and share it in a variety of different platforms. So yes, on social media, you might run into lies. Now, if you are looking at the mainstream media though, even those that lean left or right, they have responsibilities. They have editors, they have ethics, they have checks and balances. They will be held accountable if they outright lie. And so you kind of have to figure out who is the source and do they have a responsibility to ethical reporting. And this question about Facebook, there's been a lot of people who have been calling on Facebook to put up things like Twitter has done, where it indicates whether something is misinformation or a lie. And Facebook has been reluctant to do that. From that perspective, I kind of make the analogy of the sidewalk. Back when political campaigning meant, getting up on a soapbox and yelling your position, if people lied in that context, the sidewalk wouldn't be responsible. But is Facebook different? Like, do we hold Facebook and these other social media accounts because it's so behind the scenes and untransparent? Should they be more responsible than a traditional, old school street corner where someone could be lying to you and you wouldn't know it? So these are some of the questions that we tackle in communication. And as media scholars, what you find is that the relationship between audiences and media are usually way more complicated than you first anticipate. So that's why it's pretty interesting. We also know that social media, I was showing this to my class yesterday, social media, people who rely on social media for news have low political knowledge. But we also know that the people who are relying on social media are young, and they are probably not through college yet. And so age and education is also part of the variables that we can predict political knowledge increases as you get more educated and as you get older. So we don't know if it's just young people who are already low in political knowledge are the ones more frequently using social media, or if there's something inherently going on social media that makes you less politically knowledgeable. That's a question we can't answer yet. You're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Dr. Dominguez, you're.
Yep, I got it. I got it. Thank you. Yep, that happens too often. So when we're thinking about presidential campaigns, one question that comes up pretty often is how, if I'm a voter, how am I supposed to know whether the candidates are lying to me? And I think we have a reflexive cynicism that's fueled by our popular culture that says all politicians are liars all the time. And that's just not, that is not a fact. It is not a fact that politicians lie all the time. They have no incentive to do so, because if they get called out for it, then no, but people aren't going to vote for them, because who wants to vote for a liar? So in fact, politicians do not always tell the truth, but it's usually more complicated than it sounds. It's usually something where they're telling a partial truth and they're leaving out context. And sometimes they tell a whopper, right? And so one of the things that we often rely on the news media for is to be an arbiter, to do a little research and tell us, are these people telling the truth or not? But of course, the question is, if they do that, if they do a fact check on a politician's, remarks, are we even going to listen? Are we going to believe them? Does it do any good? And there is research about that. That looks a little bit like this. I'm summarizing a pretty complex theory here, but hopefully this is clear. Media research shows that media fact checks of campaign information work differently depending on people's partisanship and information background. So, for people who are politically sophisticated, they get a lot of information. They have very strong partisan predispositions, and fact checks aren't going to work on them. They're like, if they believe a lie, they are actively misinformed and they have drunk the Kool-Aid, and they are not, you can't unfact check those people. Fact checks also aren't going to work very well on people who don't pay attention to politics at all. Like, they're not going to run into a fact check. So if you lie to them, they might buy it if that's the one thing they happen to hear. But most people fall in the middle. Most people are partisan, but aren't absorbing the news all the time, and aren't passionate about their partisanship. And they're only occasionally attentive to the news. And so we have some research about how fact checks can work on these people. And for most people who are occasionally attentive, fact checks work if they're applied immediately. And if the fact checkers, that is the journalists who are saying this is a truth, this is a lie, is if the fact checkers focus on the evidence for the claim rather than the person who is making the claim or the person who is offering that evidence. So if they're fact checking something that the president has said about viruses, and they cite evidence from medical research, and they do it immediately in the context of the president's remarks, that's going to be an effective fact check. People are actually going to take that information and say, oh, okay, well, here's evidence, and then here's what the candidate said, and the candidate doesn't seem to be telling the truth about that. But this is all very contextual, right? Fact checking can work sometimes to correct misinformation, but not all the time. And we also know, on the other hand, that candidates are, candidates, let me say one more thing here, and then I'll toss it back to Dr. Moran. Candidates actually do mostly tell the truth, mostly, and they do keep their promises. Their promises when they make speeches and they say, this is the kind of policy that you can expect from me. Most of the time, they're going to try to keep those promises. And when they get up there and they have party platforms, like, it is worth paying attention to what they say about policy. They may not be able to make all of those things happen, but that is the direction that they are actually going to go in their governance. And so if you care about, judging, if you're trying to figure out who to vote for, you really should compare what they're promising you, because they are going to do that. And this is back to Dr. Moran for conclusion.
Yeah, and I think, we spend a lot of time kind of critiquing the mass media and asking you to be critical, but it is the thing we have to rely on to get information. And so we really want to emphasize that, particularly as a new voter, as a new citizen who can like exercise this right, it's really important to do some due diligence in gathering the information so that you can make an informed decision. So when you're spending time on social media or looking at mainstream news sources, who is the source? Is there an actual journalist with contact information and a name and a byline that allows the reader to know who is responsible for that information? So if you look at the New York Times or the San Diego Union Tribune or other like media outlets, most of the time, unless it's an AP Newswire source, you're going to actually have a journalist's name. And that to me gives you an opportunity to know that it is a professionally written article. You can also be that person who does fact checking. There are organizations that you can go to, these websites that I put on here, I won't click on now, but if you want to go check them out later, where you can look stuff up. You actually can be the investigator to find out if the information that you're receiving has passed these fact check organizations. And they're nonpartisan, and they can be kind of fun to investigate and do your own checking. So I just want to encourage you to trust the sources you can trust and figure out what that means to you. Who are your trustworthy sources? And also encourage you, again, not to be persuaded by the showy political communication and to do the research on the candidates. And again, we're talking about the presidential election, and we know that when presidential elections are happening, voter turnout increases. But, as Dr. Dominguez points out in a variety of USD Vote stuff, like you have to look at everything that's on the ballot, not just the president. So I encourage you to find your source and the one that you like. I
think I'm muted again, but I think now we're going to open it up for questions. Sophia?
I had a question about like the culture that we've created where what you were talking about, how parties are like basically like eating from the politicians' hands, where we take the information like verbatim and word for word, and we're not fact checking before we like spread information or understand information. Was it always like this? Like maybe it's just because I'm starting to be old enough like that I'm actually understanding politics and like looking into it more, but was it always this way where people constantly like almost see a political figure as like a godlike person and take what they say for word for word?
Yeah, this is one of the reasons that the founders of our Constitution thought democracy was kind of a bad idea. People are not that good at judging whether what they're being told is true or reasonable or plausible or anything. But we are capable of it, right? This is why you get a college education, so that you can be capable of sorting these things out for yourself. This is why education is important to democracy. And we believe in democracy and we think it can work, but there's always the chance that it doesn't work very well. And looking at public opinion data about how much people even know about basic things is always a little alarming. We are more polarized in our parties today, and that may impact our willingness to listen to people on our side versus the other side, and to trust our side more. But it really always has been that way. Other questions?
Can I ask a question? So do you think that journalists in the context of today's political climate will make the same mistake or similar mistakes as they did in 2016? What's your prediction?
I am hopeful that journalists have learned a lesson. I think that they are more cautious right now than I've seen in the past, and I think that there are. I think they will be reluctant to call this election too early. I do think that you know. I think in 2016, everyone was like surprised by Trump's like support, and I think people are less surprised by it now. So I'm guessing that that has shaped the way in which journalists will cover this election.
I have a question for just like this both of you teachers. When it comes to the idea of like false equivalencies, do you guys think that false equivalencies play a major like there's a big flaw within the binary partisan in political culture, right? Like the idea of that there always needs to be two sides to a story. And do you think that is present in today? And if yes, how can you recommend us that we avoid false equivalencies? If that makes sense.
I mean, this is really a journalism question. The idea of objectivity is a goal in journalism, and that often gets operationalized as this side says one thing, this side says the other thing. Don't know whether any side is true, but we're just going to say that there are two sides, and you know that isn't a good way to portray the truth. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a journalist, you know. It's also hard to do anything other than that. And I'm going to let Dr. Moran take that because that's her deal.
Thanks, Riley. We watched a little video on that in my class, and we've been talking about it. And I think one of the one of the things, again, the responsibility is you as a reader or you of a consumer of news to try to recognize when there's false equivalencies, because not all claims have the same evidence. And I think that becomes a really important tool for us. It's like our responsibility more than even the journalist, who again is like wrapped up in these rituals of objectivity that kind of demand this formula. Again, when you have two opposing, you can see this on the nightly news or the cable news, when they have two opposing opinions about this, or perspectives about a particular policy, one person has a bunch of credentials that make them reliable and the other person doesn't. You kind of have to determine which person do you think is providing the most credible information. And so again, I would say that is on us as consumers and citizens to do our job in making sure that what we're digesting is credible.
This is also the job of you being an educated person, right? That you need to be able to understand what credentials are relevant, right? You got a question about climate change, and you got a lawyer answering that question. Like, is that person really qualified, or a political organizer? Is that person the best person to answer a question about science? Like, what is the question, and what kinds of evidence could be brought to bear on those questions? This is why you go to school. This is what you can learn. You need to be broadly educated so that you can do that critical thinking that our media environment increasingly demands of us.
Thank you.
Do I see a lot of people hoping that this is the end of this event?
Any other questions, comments for both professors?
I have a question for Professor Dominguez. In general, like, do you think that it would ever be possible again for there to be like a third-party candidate to be chosen for president? Because I know that we talked about how like a lot of people vote based on their like partisan like followers or like the group, the party that they believe in. But do you think that a third party candidate would ever win again?
I think it's very hard. We haven't had that. The last person who was a third party candidate to win the presidency was like Abraham Lincoln. And it's because most of us are Democrats and Republicans, and because the Electoral College requires the president to win a majority, a plurality of the vote in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes, that makes it very hard for any third-party candidate. We've had third-party candidates win a couple of states, like the segregationist candidates, George Wallace in 1968, Strom Thurmond in 1948. We've had somebody like Ross Perot, who was a billionaire who just threw a lot of money at running for president in 1992, got 19% of the popular vote, no electoral votes. The way our system is set up, it's very hard for a third-party candidate to do that.
Do you think that the Electoral College, I mean, people are starting to talk about it differently than in previous elections. Do you think that's at risk? Or, I mean, are we headed towards a path of changing that?
Well, the difficulty is the people who have been burned by the Electoral College are the Democrats, who've been burned by it twice in the last 20 years. And if they get burned a third time by it, all the more burned. But you need 3/4 of the states to pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. And that would have to include some Republican states, and it would have to include some Democratic states that are small and would have very little voice at all in electing the president, like Vermont or Hawaii. That their voice would be much smaller if they didn't have those electoral votes. So it's not impossible, but it's a really heavy lift, mostly politically, to get the bipartisan support to get rid of it.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about how these two very distinct and polar parties came to be? I mean, in like America's history, there's been multiple different parties, but they all kind of died out to become these two really big ones. So can you explain a little bit more about why that happened?
That happens because we have plurality elections. In any country in the world when we elect people to our legislative bodies, to the state assembly in California or to the House of Representatives, we elect one person per district. Anytime you do that anywhere in the world, you get two big parties because there's no incentive to ever come in third. If you're the Democrats and the Green Party and the Republicans, and the Democrats and the Greens split people who care about the environment, and then the Republicans win, then the incentive is for the Democrats and the Greens to get together and be one party to beat the Republicans, right? So that plurality single member district elections always leads to a two-party system. We could get rid of it. It's not written in the Constitution anywhere. If you have proportional representation where you give seats in the legislature based on the proportion of the vote you get. So the Green Party gets 10% of the 10% of the votes, they get 10% of the seats in Congress. Different ballgame. There's lots of ways to have a multi-party system, but it's not, you can't just wish it away. It's really baked into the system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we see any other hands up or questions? No more questions? We're getting to the end of the hour. Would either professors, the professor or both professors, have any concluding remarks or?
No, I mean, I think, we've kind of wrapped it up in a good way. And I hope that what we've been able to do is shine a little optimism on the process, not just criticism. We want to believe that, we can make a difference and that we can actually find good information when we look for it. And so I hope that you're going to be paying attention in the next few months.
All right. Well, I guess we'll conclude it here. Thank you so much to both Dr. Dominguez and Dr. Moran for an extremely informative and enlightening talk. So I think we've all benefited a lot from their presentation. So thank you. And I see a lot of people clapped hands going up. So thank you very much. And thank you to the rest of you who for being here. And I guess we'll call it a night. So thanks very much. Good night.